The man known to history as James Monroe was born on the 28th of April, 1758, at his family's estate of Monroe Creek in Westmoreland County in the British colony of Virginia. His father, Spence Monroe, was born in 1727 and inherited 500 acres and at least 8 slaves from his father, providing for a comfortable but far from privileged existence. As with many gentlemen farmers of the time, Spence supplemented his income by working as a carpenter. The Monroe family had been in North America since the mid-17th century, after James's great-great-grandfather, Andrew Monroe, was exiled from his Scottish homeland during the civil wars in the British Kingdom and adopted the name Monroe. James's mother was Elizabeth Jones, the daughter of James Jones, a wealthy architect who settled in King George County after emigrating from his native Wales. Spence married Elizabeth Jones, and the couple would have 5 children, with James being the second child and eldest son. When James Jones died, he left his daughter Elizabeth 300 acres of land, thus increasing Spence and Elizabeth's holdings to 800 acres. The young James was brought up by his mother until he was around 5 years old, after which he accompanied his father in his labors, learning the basics of working on a farm. As he got older, his father took him hunting and fishing, activities that the boy enjoyed far more than the back-breaking labor of working on a tobacco farm. During these early years, his parents taught him to read and write, as well as rudimentary mathematics and Latin. James Monroe came of age during a time of political disagreements between Britain and its North American colonies. In 1763, Britain had defeated France in the French and Indian War, gaining control of Canada in the process. In order to pay for the continued defense of North America from Native American tribes and to assert parliamentary supremacy, the British Parliament passed legislation to levy taxes on the colonies. The most notorious of these was the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed all printed material, including letters and legal documents. The colonists protested, claiming that as subjects of the British Empire, they could not be subject to taxation by Parliament without representation in Parliament, and resisted the law by organizing boycotts of British trade. According to family legend, in February 1766, Spence Monroe rode off from his farm to nearby Leedstown, joining Westmoreland County landowners in signing Burgess Richard Henry Lee's proclamation, refusing to buy British goods until the repeal of the hated law. Although the Stamp Act was repealed in March 1766, Parliament continued to assert the right of taxation over the American colonies, and tensions continued to brew. In 1769, the 11-year-old James was sent to the Campbelltown Academy, run by Reverend Archibald Campbell of the neighboring Westmoreland Anglican Church. The young boy had to walk several miles from the farm to school each day, where he learned Latin, Greek, French, mathematics, and history, while earning a reputation for being a hardworking student. Among the other students at the academy was John Marshall, a boy 3 years older who would become a lifelong friend, despite their later political differences. In 1772, James' mother Elizabeth died after giving birth to her 4th son Joseph, and a couple of years later, his father Spence followed his wife to the grave, leaving the 16-year-old James as the owner of the family's 800 acres and head of the household with responsibility for his elder sister and 3 younger brothers. At this moment, his maternal uncle, Joseph Jones, stepped into the fray and provided the family with financial support. Jones was a lawyer who served on the Virginia House of Burgesses alongside George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson, and he became an important mentor to his nephew. Jones arranged for James's elder sister, Elizabeth, to take charge of the house and her younger brothers, while James was sent to the College of William and Mary in the colonial capital of Williamsburg. By the time Monroe began his studies at college, political tensions between Parliament and the colonies had reached a boiling point. Following passage of the Tea Act in May 1773, In December, protesters in Massachusetts staged the Boston Tea Party, throwing valuable tea overboard from a British East India Company ship into Boston Harbor. The incident prompted Parliament to crack down on the rebellious New England colony by closing Boston Harbor, thus prompting Whig leaders in the American colonies to send representatives from 12 colonies to an extra-legal gathering they called the First Continental Congress in September to discuss a joint boycott of British goods. Across the British American colonies, people began to divide over whether to support the actions of the protesters or to defend Parliament and the Empire. The division between patriots and loyalists was not at first over whether to break the British colonies from the British Empire, but rather over how the British Empire should view its colonies and what rights should be afforded to the citizens of the various British colonies. On the 19th of April, 1775, Patriot militiamen exchanged fire with British soldiers under the command of Thomas Gage at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, after the British general attempted to seize gunpowder stores. The following day, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, gave similar orders to remove the gunpowder from Williamsburg's powder magazine under the cover of darkness. When locals realized what was going on in the morning, Monroe and his fellow students joined a crowd that marched on the governor's palace. The incident triggered a chain of events which resulted in Dunmore fleeing from America on a British ship in early June. Distracted from his studies, Monroe spent much of the summer of 1775 drilling on the college green. That June, General George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army by the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. As Congress launched a recruiting drive to bolster Washington's ranks, Virginia agreed to raise 6 more regiments. The 3rd Regiment was led by Colonel Hugh Mercer, a Scotsman whose military experience included fighting with Bonnie Prince Charlie at Culloden in 1745 and with Washington at Fort Duquesne in 1755. Mercer was a friend of Joseph Jones and appointed Monroe as a lieutenant in Captain John Thornton's company. The other 2 lieutenants were John Marshall, Monroe's friend at Campbelltown, and James Mercer, Monroe's roommate and close friend at William and Mary. After intensive training, the 3rd Regiment was ordered to march north and join Washington's army in New York in June 1776. On the 4th of July, Monroe and his fellow soldiers heard the proclamation of the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson and adopted by Congress a couple of days earlier. While marching north, the Virginians received news of the Continental Army's defeat at the Battle of Long Island on the 27th of August. Washington's men had nearly been trapped by General William Howe's 32,000-man army and a powerful fleet under his brother Admiral Richard Howe. But incredibly, the Continentals managed to evacuate to Manhattan on the night of the 29th. By the time the Virginians arrived on the 13th of September, Washington's headquarters were at Harlem Heights overlooking Manhattan. On the 16th, Monroe received his baptismal fire as a Continental soldier when the 1st and 3rd Virginia regiments repelled a British attack in a rare success for the Continentals. By October, Washington was down to 5,000 men and decided the only way he could save his army was to retreat across New Jersey to eastern Pennsylvania. As Washington put his plan into motion, his army was relentlessly pursued by the British forces. With Washington's army on the western shore of the Delaware River, Howe stopped the pursuit in mid-December to take up winter quarters, leaving 1,500 Hessian mercenaries in Trenton, New Jersey. On Christmas Day, 1776, Washington planned a night raid across the Delaware to surprise the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The general's distant cousin, Captain William Washington, volunteered to lead a detachment attacking from the north, and Monroe volunteered to serve as his junior officer. On the morning of the 26th, Washington and Monroe led the Continental vanguard through a snowstorm and attacked at 8 o'clock. Although rudely surprised, the disciplined Hessians organized the defense and fierce fighting ensued. After successfully launching a charge to secure a pair of captured Hessian guns, Washington and Monroe continued to rush into a mass of Hessians. After Washington was wounded, Monroe took over the attack before being struck by a musket ball through his shoulder, which severed an artery. He was taken to Dr. John Riker, a local patriot who had joined them that morning, who managed to stop the bleeding. While the surgeons operated on him, the Continentals celebrated a glorious triumph, capturing almost 1,000 Hessians with minimal losses. After being taken back across the Delaware, Monroe spent the next 3 months recovering in eastern Pennsylvania. After his heroics at Trenton, Monroe was promoted to captain in a new regiment being formed in Virginia. However, when he returned home, he was only able to recruit a handful of volunteers. He accompanied his uncle Joseph Jones as he returned to Congress in Philadelphia, which was anticipating an attack by Howe at any moment. After arriving back at Washington's camp in August, Monroe served on the staff of William Alexander, a major general who claimed the Scottish noble title of Lord Stirling. As a staff officer, Monroe was introduced to Washington's aides, including Alexander Hamilton and the young French nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette, whom Monroe promptly befriended. Monroe accompanied Stirling during the American defeat at Brandywine Creek on the 11th of September 1777, which allowed Howe to capture the capital of Philadelphia. On the 4th of October, he was by Stirling's side when the general's horse was shot from under him at the Battle of Germantown. While Washington's army struggled to survive their stay at the winter quarters at Valley Forge, Monroe was promoted to major, and a Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben appeared at headquarters and began to instill German discipline into the army. In May 1778, news arrived that France had signed a treaty of alliance with the United States, prompted in part by General Horatio Gates's victory over John Burgoyne at Saratoga the previous autumn. The new British commander, General Sir Henry Clinton, decided to evacuate Philadelphia and return to New York, prompting Washington to attack his rear guard at Monmouth on the 28th of June. After General Charles Lee mishandled the attack, Washington arrived with Stirling to hold the Continental line. Monroe led a detachment on a reconnaissance and found that the British were planning to attack Washington's right, allowing the American commander to respond and repulse the British charge. Having been praised for his conduct in battle, Monroe longed for a command of his own and left Stirling's staff. When Washington's aide, John Lawrence, proposed raising a regiment of black slaves to defend his native South Carolina with the promise of freedom after the war, Monroe asked Alexander Hamilton for a recommendation. Although Lawrence's scheme was endorsed by Congress, the South Carolina and Georgia legislatures resoundingly rejected the idea. After returning to Virginia and being unable to find a militia command, Monroe went to see Governor Thomas Jefferson. The governor took a liking to the young Monroe and offered to tutor him in law, making sure not only to familiarize him with the relevant laws of the day, but also important historical and philosophical texts associated with the development of legal principles. When Virginia was threatened by a British attack from the sea in April 1780, Jefferson moved the state capital inland from Williamsburg to Richmond, and Monroe accompanied him, deciding at the same time to sell his 500-acre family farm. In June, Monroe was dispatched by the governor to establish a chain of relay posts from Richmond to North Carolina to warn of any British attack. By July, Horatio Gates took over command in the southern colonies, only to be defeated shortly thereafter by General Charles Cornwallis at Camden in mid-August of 1780. Gates's defeat allowed the British to march towards Virginia, and a British army under Benedict Arnold, the former Continental Army general who had treacherously switched sides, invaded Virginia and sacked Richmond. Washington responded by sending a small force under Lafayette to Virginia. Unable to find a command with his friend, Monroe served as a volunteer in the 15,000-strong Allied army under Washington and the French General Rochambeau, as it surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown, forcing the British general to surrender in October 1781. After completing his law studies, Monroe was admitted to the bar. and in April 1782, he was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, serving alongside his friends John Mercer and John Marshall, and within a few months, he was named to the state's 8-man Privy Council. At the end of the year, he was elected to the Confederation Congress, established in 1781, following the ratification of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles had been drawn up by the Continental Congress to create a government for the 13 United States, but in their efforts to avoid repeating the British model of a powerful central government, the delegates left Congress weak, providing it with the means to declare war and conduct diplomacy, but without a standing army or navy or the power of taxation. Monroe was now Jefferson's congressional colleague, and the older man began to mentor him in the art of politics. After Monroe voted to ratify the Treaty of Paris in January 1784, which ended the Revolutionary War on extremely favorable terms for the United States, he voted with the other Virginia delegates in ceding Virginia's land northwest of the Ohio River to the federal government. But illness caused him to miss a crucial vote on a clause drafted by Jefferson to ban slavery in the territory by 1800. In May 1784, Jefferson departed for Paris to assist Benjamin Franklin in his ambassadorial duties in France. Before doing so, he introduced Monroe to his friend James Madison, a man 7 years older who would take Jefferson's place as Monroe's mentor and confidant during his absence. That summer, Monroe went on a lengthy journey to western New York to participate in talks with the Native American tribes, becoming friends with the native leader Joseph Brant. Upon his return to Congress in October, he argued that British garrisons which remained in the Northwest in defiance of the Treaty of Paris should be withdrawn as soon as possible. In January 1785, Congress moved to New York City, and it was there that Monroe met the 17-year-old Elizabeth Courtwright, who hailed from a wealthy merchant family. Monroe had befriended all 4 Courtwright sisters, but was especially captivated by the charming and intelligent Elizabeth, whom he married on the 16th of February 1786. The couple would go on to have 2 daughters and a son who died in infancy. Back in Congress, Monroe chaired a congressional committee to oversee negotiations with Spain over rights to the Mississippi River, which divided the United States and Spanish Louisiana in the west. After the King of Spain stopped negotiating with the United States over the dispute, Secretary of Foreign Affairs John Jay had agreed a treaty with Spanish Representative Don Diego de Cardequi to give the Spanish exclusive navigation rights to the southern part of the Mississippi for 25 years. Jay was supported by the northern states, which considered Spanish trade more important than the Mississippi, but Monroe and his southern allies believed otherwise. The Virginia congressman led the southern opposition to the treaty, which failed to obtain the support of the 9 states required for ratification. In 1786, Monroe resigned from Congress and returned to his native Virginia, where he opened a law practice in Fredericksburg. The following year, he was elected to the House of Delegates, but kept a close eye on the convention which gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787 to consider amendments to the Articles of Confederation. As James Madison was responsible for calling the meeting, Monroe was disappointed not to have been elected a delegate. On the 17th of September, the convention adjourned, and the text of the proposed Constitution of the United States, designed to replace the Articles of Confederation, appeared in newspapers throughout the country. Monroe had been a critic of Congress's weaknesses under the Articles and was a member of the Virginia Ratifying Convention, which met in June 1788. Although General Washington had presided over the convention, and James Madison had been responsible for writing much of the document, their fellow Virginians were more evenly divided. While Madison championed his creation, the fiery orator Patrick Henry led the anti-federalist opposition. Monroe was part of a group in the middle who believed that the Constitution should be accompanied by a Bill of Rights. In the end, Madison agreed to a compromise to consider amendments after ratification, and the convention voted in favor of ratification 89-79, becoming the 10th state to ratify the document. In an act of revenge for his defeat over the Constitution, Henry maneuvered to prevent Madison from being selected as one of Virginia's 2 senators, and then recruited Monroe to run against Madison for the House of Representatives. Although reluctant to challenge his friend, Monroe's ambition and sense of duty motivated him to accept Henry's offer, but Madison emerged victorious on Election Day in February 1789. George Washington was unanimously elected President of the United States and took office at the end of April. For several years, Monroe sought to move to Albemarle County in order to be closer to Jefferson's estate in Monticello. At this time, he had exchanged a large tract of land he had been awarded in Kentucky for his service during the Revolutionary War for an 800-acre estate previously owned by George Nicholas, a colleague on the House of Delegates. In December 1789, Jefferson returned from Paris and visited Monroe before taking up his responsibilities as Washington's Secretary of State. In November 1790, Monroe was elected to the United States Senate, taking the seat which had initially been filled by his late cousin, William Grayson. On the 6th of December, he was sworn in as a senator by Vice President John Adams. The issue dominating American politics at the time was the financial and economic reforms introduced by Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton believed that his reforms would strengthen the national government so that the United States could achieve economic prosperity and enjoy greater security from potential enemies. Most of his supporters came from the northern states and called themselves Federalists. Hamilton's opponents believed that the Treasury Secretary's policies were far too similar to Great Britain's economic system and believed that it risked creating a despotic government, and described themselves as Republicans. By the time Monroe arrived in the Senate, Hamilton had already managed to obtain congressional approval to create the national debt, but a second battle was looming over the creation of a national bank. While Madison led the opposition in the House, Monroe was one of only 5 men to vote against it in the Senate. Both men were closely aligned with Jefferson, but the Secretary of State could not openly oppose his own administration, but he could instruct his friends to do so in Congress and in the press. Although they wrote anonymously adopting names from Roman antiquity, Madison and Monroe exchanged insults with Hamilton himself in the papers of the day. In 1792, Monroe and Virginia Representative Abraham Venable were approached by former Speaker of the House Frederick Muhlenberg to investigate allegations that Hamilton was embezzling federal funds. In November, Jacob Clingman, Muhlenberg's former clerk, had been arrested along with his friend James Reynolds for forgery. Clingman told his former boss that Reynolds told him that he received government funds and insider information from Hamilton to speculate on government securities. When the 3 men raised the issue with Hamilton in December, they were shocked and embarrassed to hear a detailed confession from the Treasury Secretary that he had not given James Reynolds money to speculate in the markets, but to keep secret his affair with James's wife Maria. The 3 men agreed not to speak of the matter ever again, but while Muhlenberg and Venable were satisfied by the explanation, when Hamilton requested his papers pertaining to the affair be returned to him, Monroe had them faithfully copied out by John Beckley, the clerk of the House of Representatives, and a Republican partisan, before sending them back to Hamilton. Either Monroe or Beckley informed Jefferson and Madison, but Hamilton was cleared of financial wrongdoing, and the affair with Maria Reynolds remained secret for 5 years. By 1793, the American political debate shifted to the arena of foreign policy. The French Revolution of 1789 was turning increasingly violent, and by January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine, leading Britain to declare war on France in February. After news reached the United States, in April, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality between the 2 warring parties. The same month, the French envoy, Edmond Charles Genet, arrived on American shores to large demonstrations of popular support, boosting the Republicans, who sympathized with the French, and frightening the Federalists, who leaned towards the British. Genet made it his business to recruit American sailors to join French privateers attacking British shipping, and when asked by Washington to stop, he threatened to appeal to the American people above the president's head. Monroe had followed Jefferson's lead in supporting Genet. By the summer, even Jefferson became frustrated by the Frenchman's behavior, and Monroe and Madison encouraged Virginians to adopt a set of resolutions they wrote, which praised Washington, denounced the neutrality policy for violating the French alliance from 1778, and attacked Hamilton for seeking to replicate the British Constitution in America. At the end of 1793, Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State, partly as a result of the Genet affair. In early 1794, Britain closed the British West Indies to American trade and began to force American sailors to join the Royal Navy by claiming they were deserters from British ships, a practice known as impressment. Monroe led the Republican opposition in the Senate in calling for a boycott of British trade, while the Federalists hoped to send a special envoy to negotiate a treaty with Britain to resolve the disputes. When Washington nominated Chief Justice John Jay, Monroe argued that the appointment undermined the independence of the judiciary, but failed to prevent Jay's nomination. In late May, Secretary of State Edmund Randolph offered Monroe the post of Minister to France, replacing Gouverneur Morris, the New York Federalist who had failed to endear himself to France. Armed with Randolph's instructions to maintain friendly relations while asserting American neutrality, Monroe departed from Baltimore with his family and arrived in Le Havre on the 31st of July, reaching Paris on the 2nd of August. The Monroes arrived in France days after the radical leader, Maximilien Robespierre, was overthrown and guillotined in a coup. The political turmoil hindered Monroe's attempts to present his credentials, but on the 14th of August, he spoke to the National Convention about the shared principles of the American and French republics and received an enthusiastic response, after which he was recognized as American Minister to France. Monroe's duties involved representing and assisting Americans in France, some of whom had been imprisoned during the revolutionary turmoil. In particular, he helped to secure the release from prison of Thomas Paine, the radical political writer whose pamphlets Common Sense and The American Crisis championed the patriot cause during the American Revolutionary War. Monroe also intervened on behalf of Adrienne de Lafayette, the wife of the Marquis who had voluntarily entered an Austrian prison to be with her husband. Her husband had been one of the leaders of the revolution in 1789, but in the midst of the political turmoil, he had escaped to the Austrian Netherlands in 1792, following a treason charge, but because of his politics had been placed in prison by the Austrians. Unconvinced that the Lafayette's captors would release Adrienne based on her husband's reputation as an American hero, Monroe allowed his wife Elizabeth to encourage public sympathy by making several visits to Adrienne in prison, an initiative which eventually secured her release. Although he made himself popular in France, Monroe received a rebuke from Secretary of State Randolph that he was being too close to France. For Monroe, this was a sign that Washington's administration had become increasingly federalist, and he suspected that John Jay was conveying British complaints about Monroe across the Atlantic. When Monroe informed Randolph that he had only done what he was instructed, and that closer relations with France would give Jay more leverage with London, Randolph told him to carry on. In November 1794, Jay signed a treaty with British Foreign Minister Lord Grenville, but sought to keep the terms secret. He had managed to secure the withdrawal of British forces from the northwest forts and negotiated a commercial treaty, but had not made any progress with the impressment of American sailors in the Caribbean. Days after the Senate approved the Jay Treaty in June 1795, the text became publicly available and caused an outcry. Monroe only learned of its contents in American papers in August and was infuriated that Randolph had not sent him a copy. By then, the Federalist Timothy Pickering was Secretary of State, and it was only in December that Monroe received a copy of the treaty. When Foreign Minister Delacroix informed him that the Jay Treaty invalidated the 1778 alliance, Monroe made a valiant effort to defend Franco-American relations. This led Washington's Federalist cabinet to demand his recall, and in December 1796, he was replaced by Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Monroe returned to America around the time John Adams succeeded Washington as president in March 1797. He was soon confronted by Alexander Hamilton, who accused him of leaking documents to James Thomson Callender, the Republican journalist who had publicized the Reynolds affair. The two men came close to a duel, which was only averted following the intervention of Monroe's second and Hamilton's New York rival, Aaron Burr. After returning to Virginia and meeting with Jefferson and Madison, in 1798 Monroe published a lengthy defense of his conduct in France, which criticized the Washington administration. Washington was outraged and annotated Monroe's book with expressions of fury, but said nothing in public. In the meantime, Monroe supervised the construction of a new house called Highland on a 2,500-acre estate next to Jefferson's Monticello. By late 1799, Monroe was ready to return to the political fray and was elected governor of Virginia in December. He hoped that the governorship might enable him to heal his rift with Washington, but the former president died on the 14th of December, the day before Monroe arrived in Richmond. Monroe's powers as governor of Virginia were limited to being commander of the state militia and sharing executive power with the 8-man Privy Council. With these powers, he purchased weapons for the state militia and built an armory on the James River. On the 30th of August, 1800, Monroe received reports of a slave uprising led by a blacksmith named Gabriel, and over the next few days, he organized efforts to suppress the uprising. After several enslaved people were hanged, Monroe adopted a more lenient approach by hanging only the ringleaders and setting the others free. Monroe knew that the slaves were motivated by a similar spirit to the patriots of 1776, but while he acknowledged the injustice, he knew that any steps to abolish slavery would be fatal to his political ambitions. Monroe supported Jefferson's candidacy in the 1800 presidential elections against Adams, where a healthy Republican majority in the Virginia House of Delegates ensured that its 21 electoral votes were cast for its native son. However, while Jefferson had defeated Adams, he had tied with his running mate Aaron Burr, throwing the election to the House of Representatives. Despite efforts by some Federalists to choose Burr, Jefferson eventually triumphed. On the 4th of March, Jefferson assumed the presidency in the new capital of Washington, D.C., on the banks of the Potomac River, where he made a conciliatory speech declaring, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." As the Virginians considered how to prevent future slave insurrections, Monroe asked the president for advice on removing enslaved Africans and their descendants to Africa. After identifying the British colony of Sierra Leone as the perfect solution, the idea was dropped when Monroe found that slavery was not permitted in the colony, and Monroe had no desire to free them before they arrived in Africa. At the end of 1801, Monroe was re-elected to a third term as governor, during which he promoted public infrastructure and the establishment of a public school system. The legislators were unwilling to provide the funds for these, while Monroe faced another slave rebellion. Monroe had planned to return to a legal practice after the end of his governorship, but in January 1803, he received an offer from Jefferson to return to Paris on a diplomatic mission. In November 1799, General Napoleon Bonaparte had taken power in France, and in 1800, he negotiated a treaty with Spain to transfer Louisiana back to France by 1803. The prospect of a strengthened French presence alarmed Jefferson, who considered plans to purchase the port of New Orleans on the mouth of the Mississippi. According to the instructions given to him by James Madison, now Jefferson's Secretary of State, after his mission to France, Monroe was also to go to Spain to negotiate the purchase of Florida. The Monroes arrived in France in April and met with Robert Livingston, who who had been attempting to negotiate a purchase since 1802. By early 1803, the French army, which Napoleon had sent to suppress the slave uprising in Haiti, had disintegrated from yellow fever and the stiff resistance by the Haitian revolutionaries, and the First Consul was planning for the resumption of war with Great Britain and desperately needed money. On the 10th of April, Napoleon informed his finance minister, François Barbé Marbois, that he was prepared to sell the whole of Louisiana. Although Livingston had hoped to get the credit for negotiating the purchase himself, he was persuaded to work with Monroe, and on the 30th, Monroe and Livingston agreed with Barbé Marbois to buy Louisiana for $15 million. As they discussed how to finance the deal, Monroe revealed that representatives from the Hope and Bearings Bank in London had approached him a few days earlier to offer a loan which sealed the deal. Rather than go to Spain, Monroe went to Britain in July to take over from Rufus King as minister to Great Britain. The main subject of dispute remained the impressment of American sailors, the issue which Jay had tried and failed to resolve. As a Francophile, Monroe was an unusual choice to serve as ambassador in London, but his meetings with King George III and Foreign Secretary Lord Hawkesbury established a level of mutual respect. Nevertheless, with Prime Minister Henry Addington's government on the verge of collapse, Monroe concluded that the British were not interested in negotiations. When Addington's government fell in April 1804, William Pitt, the younger, returned to office as Prime Minister, and Lord Harrowby was appointed Foreign Secretary. After meeting with Harrowby in August, Monroe understood that no agreement would be forthcoming. He therefore left for Spain, hoping to persuade Spain to cede West Florida, which the Americans considered part of Louisiana. En route, he stopped in Paris and attended Napoleon's coronation at Notre Dame on the 2nd of December 1804. After arriving in Madrid, neither Monroe nor his colleague Charles Pinckney were able to make progress on the issue in talks with Foreign Minister Pedro Savalas Guerra and the royal favorite Manuel Godoy. So after writing to Madison to propose seizing Florida by force, Monroe returned to Britain. After returning to Britain in July 1805, Monroe was sidelined by a third Foreign Secretary, Lord Mulgrave, who had been in his post since January. However, the death of Pitt in January 1806 led to a new administration under his cousin, Lord Grenville, the same man who had negotiated with John Jay as Foreign Secretary. More importantly, Grenville's Foreign Secretary was Charles James Fox, a Whig leader and a sympathizer to Monroe's cause. Almost immediately, Monroe received encouraging signs, but the American diplomat was forced to wait, while Fox attempted to persuade his cabinet colleagues. In August, William Pinckney arrived to assist Monroe in negotiations, while Fox fell ill and died in September. Despite this, the new British negotiators, Fox's nephew, Lord Holland, and President of the Board of Trade, Lord Auckland, remained keen to come to an agreement. On the 31st of December, the four agreed to a treaty which improved on the terms Jay obtained 12 years earlier, but stopped short of a ban on impressment, only a commitment for British subjects and American citizens not to commit any outrage against each other. Disappointed that there was no ban on impressment, Jefferson decided not to send it to the Senate for ratification. The president's decision frustrated Monroe, who knew that he could not get better terms, especially after Grenville's administration fell in March 1807. In June 1807, the British warship HMS Leopard attacked the American frigate USS Chesapeake and killed 4 American sailors. Monroe's efforts to discuss compensation with Foreign Secretary George Canning came to no avail, and at the end of the year, he decided to return home while Jefferson introduced the Embargo Act to ban all trade with foreign nations. With the 1808 election looming, Jefferson decided to step down following Washington's precedent of limiting himself to 2 terms, and Madison was his obvious successor. When Monroe went to Washington to meet his old friends, the President and Secretary of State avoided political topics making it clear that they were unhappy with Monroe. In response, Monroe allowed the Old Republicans, a group who believed the Louisiana Purchase was unconstitutional, to put his name forward for the presidency. To his surprise, Monroe also received the support of Richmond Federalists, but in the end, Madison won Virginia and the presidential election of November 1808 easily. As Monroe returned home, he became a full-time plantation farmer and gradually mended relations first with Jefferson and later with Madison. In early 1810, Monroe returned to the House of Delegates, and a year later he was elected governor of Virginia. During this time, Madison ordered the annexation and occupation of West Florida. 2 months after his election as governor, Monroe was offered the post of Secretary of State by President Madison, and he assumed the office on the 6th of April. While American ships suffered attacks from both the British and the French, Monroe adopted a tough line with their respective ministers, Sir Augustus John Foster and Louis Serrurier. In late 1811, young Republicans in the House, including Speaker Henry Clay of Kentucky and Congressman John Calhoun of South Carolina, loudly clamored for war with Great Britain, receiving the nickname War Hawks. Monroe had gradually come to the conclusion that war was preferable to pointless negotiations. In the spring of 1812, Madison and Monroe presented a dossier of papers hinting at links between New England Federalists and Britain, claiming that the British were plotting with the Federalists to partition the United States and reincorporate New England into the empire. As the drumbeat of war grew steadily louder, Congress declared war on Great Britain on the 18th of June, 1812. The war began badly when General William Hull's invasion of Canada was easily repulsed, and he surrendered at Detroit on the 16th of August. Recalling his service during the Revolutionary War, Monroe was keen to take a field command, and Madison briefly considered Monroe as Hull's replacement, but appointed William Henry Harrison instead. A few days later, Hull's nephew Isaac commanded the USS Constitution as it withstood several broadsides from HMS Guerrier before returning fire and immobilizing the enemy ship within half an hour. The triumph of the Constitution helped Madison win re-election in 1812. In January 1813, Madison dismissed Secretary of War William Eustis and asked Monroe to temporarily take over at the War Department. Monroe responded by bombarding Congress with recruitment proposals and strategic plans. In order to stem the number of desertions, Monroe sought to ensure that the men were well equipped. After Congress objected to Monroe taking over the War Department personally, Madison appointed General John Armstrong to the post. Armstrong carried on Monroe's efforts to improve recruitment and supply, and promoted promising young officers such as Winfield Scott and Andrew Jackson to high command. However, Monroe warned Madison that Armstrong's desire to seek a field command while serving in the cabinet created a dangerous precedent. In early 1813, Monroe received a letter from John Quincy Adams, the American minister in St. Petersburg, which contained an offer from Tsar Alexander to mediate in the war. Madison accepted and sent Delaware Senator James Bayard and his Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin to Russia with instructions that any peace that did not deal with impressment was no peace at all. During the summer, President Madison and Vice President Elbridge Gerry were seriously ill, and on the 15th of July, Monroe received news that Admiral George Cockburn's fleet was sailing up the Potomac River. While Armstrong dismissed the idea that the British would attack Washington, Monroe personally embarked on a reconnaissance mission. By the time he was recalled to Washington, the British fleet turned back to the Chesapeake Bay after finding the Potomac too shallow. With Washington out of danger for the time being, Monroe could celebrate a naval victory over the British at Lake Erie on the 10th of September, as well as Harrison's triumph at the Thames River in early October, which claimed the life of the Native American leader Tecumseh. In late 1813, Armstrong organized an unsuccessful offensive in the north, which aimed to capture Montreal, and in his absence, Monroe once again took charge of the War Department, infuriating Madison. When Monroe received news from Secretary of the Navy William Jones that Armstrong was planning to conscript an army of 85,000 men and lead it himself, he feared that the Secretary of War might win glory on the battlefield and challenge him for the 1816 presidential election, or simply use it to overthrow the government. Madison refused to dismiss Armstrong for the time being, and Armstrong's conscription proposal was defeated in Congress. In December, Madison received a message from British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh rejecting Russian mediation and proposing direct talks to end the conflict. Monroe convinced the president to accept, and Henry Clay and veteran diplomat Jonathan Russell were appointed to the Peace Commission alongside Adams, Bayard, and Gallatin. Expanding on Madison's instructions, Monroe hoped that the peace commissioners might persuade Britain to cede Canada to the United States. Developments in Europe in the meantime threatened to strengthen Britain's negotiating position, particularly following the defeat of Napoleon in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, allowing Allied Austrian, Russian, and Prussian armies to invade France during the winter, while the Duke of Wellington's British army crossed the Pyrenees into southern France. After the Allies occupied Paris, Napoleon's abdication at the beginning of April ended the war in Europe. Britain was now free to turn her armies to the United States, perhaps with Wellington at their head. The British and American negotiators began peace talks in the city of Ghent, in Belgium, where the Americans were informed that impressment was off the table. In June 1814, Monroe again received reports of an imminent attack on Washington, and, as he had previously done, Armstrong dismissed the fears. Despite Monroe's pleas to defend the capital, the city was left unfortified when 4,000 men under General Robert Ross sailed into the Chesapeake, conveyed by Admiral Alexander Cochrane's fleet. Monroe led a scouting party and found Ross and his men marching towards Washington. After giving orders to his wife, Dolly, to remove valuable items and documents from the president's house, Madison accompanied his cabinet to Bladensburg, where on the 24th of August, 7,000 American militiamen under General William Winder were routed by Ross's 1,500 veterans. Although the British suffered higher casualties, Ross's men were free to march into the American capital. While Madison and his cabinet colleagues escaped, Monroe remained in Washington to witness the city being burned to the ground before fleeing himself. By the 27th, the British had abandoned Washington, and Monroe and Madison returned to the capital that evening to survey the damage. Monroe was asked once again to take over duties as Secretary of War, following Armstrong's resignation on the 30th. After personally supervising further military actions on the Potomac, Monroe left General Samuel Smith to mount a successful defense of Baltimore, which claimed the life of Robert Ross on the 12th of September. Responding to rumors that the British were planning an attack on New Orleans, Monroe ordered General Andrew Jackson to hurry to the city. With the Treasury almost empty, the new Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Dallas, proposed the creation of a second national bank after Madison had allowed the first bank's charter to expire in 1811, but it took until 1816 for Congress to agree. In the meantime, Monroe received news from the commissioners in Ghent that the British were trying to dictate peace terms which were unacceptable to the United States. After Monroe instructed the commissioners to propose a peace based on the status quo before the war to reflect the United States' willingness to end the war, the British adopted a spirit of conciliation, prompted in part by Wellington's refusal to go to America. On the 3rd of February, 1815, Monroe was informed that Jackson had won a great victory at New Orleans on the 8th of January, inflicting more than 2,000 enemy casualties, including Wellington's brother-in-law, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, at the cost of fewer than 100 American killed and wounded. In mid-February, news of the Treaty of Ghent arrived, confirming the situation was as it existed before the war. Following the end of the war, Monroe relinquished his duties in the War Department on the 15th of March and returned to the State Department. His accomplishments over the next 2 years included obtaining a peace accord with the Barbary States after Commodore Stephen Decatur defeated the Algerian fleet in the Second Barbary War. With Madison in poor health and nearing the end of his second term, Monroe was widely expected to be his successor following the 1816 presidential elections. Although the Republican nomination was not guaranteed, he successfully fended off his closest rival, Secretary of War William Crawford, while New York Governor Daniel Tompkins was selected as his running mate. With the Federalist Party on its last legs, Rufus King agreed to run for president, but was defeated by Monroe in a landslide. On the 4th of March, 1817, the 59-year-old James Monroe was inaugurated as the 5th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he set out his priorities, including strengthening the country's defenses, improving public infrastructure, and developing American industry. Following the speech, Monroe's old-school friend, Chief Justice John Marshall, administered the oath of office. Although he had been a partisan of Jefferson and Madison since the early days of the Republic, President Monroe sought to eliminate party divisions and represent the whole country. He asked William Crawford to remain at the Treasury, where Madison had moved him in October 1816, and appointed South Carolina's John Calhoun Secretary of War. He appointed John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State. During the summer of 1817, Monroe embarked on a tour of the northern and eastern part of the country, reliving the memories of the Revolutionary War and receiving an enthusiastic welcome everywhere he went, including the Federalist heartland in New England, where a Boston newspaper described Monroe's visit as heralding an era of good feelings. After returning briefly to Virginia, he and Elizabeth arrived in Washington in October, where they moved into the president's house while it was still being rebuilt from the damage done 3 years earlier. As part of the reconstruction work, the gray sandstone of the presidential residence was painted white, and from this time onward, the building became known as the White House. Monroe also supervised the construction of new buildings for his cabinet departments. Following the American annexation of West Florida, the Seminole Indians routinely launched raids into the territory from Spanish East Florida. In January 1818, Monroe ordered General Andrew Jackson to lead an army against the Seminoles, while taking care not to attack any Spanish forts. Jackson wrote to Monroe and proposed to take the war to the Spanish and claimed that he could conquer East Florida within 60 days. Monroe was ill at the time and did not read Jackson's letter, which was dealt with by Secretary of War Calhoun, but he may have quietly approved of Jackson's approach. The general did not only capture the Spanish town of Pensacola, but drew Britain into the diplomatic row after executing a couple of British subjects captured alongside the Seminoles. Congress blamed Monroe for attempting to provoke war from Spain, and the president wrote to Jackson, criticizing him for exceeding orders. In the meantime, Secretary of State Adams was negotiating with the Spanish envoy Luis de Onís to purchase East Florida. After several months of talks, Adams and Onís signed a treaty on the 22nd of February, 1819, in which Spain agreed to the formal cession of both East and West Florida to the United States in return for new boundaries west of the Mississippi that recognized Spanish control of Texas. While the Senate ratified the treaty unanimously, King Ferdinand of Spain would not do so until 1821. The controversy over Jackson's actions in Florida coincided with a congressional investigation into the Bank of the United States' role in land speculation in the Western Territories. In order to save itself, the National Bank stopped giving out loans, which, in addition to the post-war surplus in manufactured goods from Europe, which flooded into American markets, contributed to the economic crisis known as the Panic of 1819, during which land values fell by 75%. With limited means at his disposal to address the economic downturn, Monroe embarked on a tour of the South and West. While in Nashville with General Jackson, he witnessed the economic devastation that had been caused to the city. By the time he reached Frankfort in Kentucky, he promised his audience that he was prepared to work with Congress to find a solution to the economic difficulties. Although the president planned to cross the Mississippi and go to St. Louis, Monroe's exhaustion cut the tour short, and he returned to Washington in August. The troubles over Florida and the Panic of 1819 were overshadowed by the debates raging across the United States about the status of Missouri, which would become the greatest crisis of Monroe's entire presidency. In February 1819, Representative James Talmadge of New York introduced amendments to ban slavery in response to Missouri's application for statehood. After heated debate, the amendments were narrowly passed in the House, but defeated in the Senate. When the new session of Congress met in March 1819, Congressman John Holmes, representing the District of Maine in the state of Massachusetts, presented a motion for Maine statehood. In response, Speaker Henry Clay refused to advance the measure without the admission of Missouri as a slave state. Over the coming months, both houses of Congress were dominated by discussions surrounding slavery and questions of its legality and morality. On the 15th of December, the southern state of Alabama was admitted to the Union as a slave state. The status of slavery in Alabama was accepted by the free states in the North, since slavery already existed and the surrounding states were all slave states. Alabama's admission as the 22nd state created a balance of 11 free states in the North and 11 slave states in the South, giving them equal representation in the Senate. With slavery now becoming the most important political issue in the country, the status of slavery in Missouri could determine the future of the institution in the United States. While he was privately opposed to slavery, Monroe was a slave owner and knew that he could not express any anti-slavery sentiments without losing support in the South during a presidential election year. He was keen to have both Missouri and Maine admitted to the Union as soon as possible. While Clay sought a compromise in Congress, Monroe persuaded Senator James Barber to introduce a motion in the Senate to link Maine's admission to that of Missouri. After the House passed a resolution admitting Maine as a free state on the 3rd of January 1820, the Northerners, led by the veteran Federalist Rufus King, were in no mood to compromise. The Illinois Senator Jesse Thomas proposed an amendment allowing Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, but to ban slavery north of Missouri's southern boundary line of parallel 36 degrees, 30 minutes north. When Monroe's support became publicly known, the negative reaction in Virginia led to fears that the president would not be renominated in his home state. The president responded by warning Southerners that extending slavery to Missouri without a compromise might cause a Northerner to be elected president, while warning Northerners that Southern states might secede from the Union if slavery were banned. On the 17th of February, the Senate passed the Missouri bill with the Thomas Amendment by 24 votes to 20, only to be rejected in the House. In response, Henry Clay set up a joint committee to recommend compromise, and on the 1st of March held 2 votes. The House narrowly passed the Missouri bill without restriction on slavery 90-87, and in a second vote, it banned slavery north of the compromise line 134-42. The following day, the Senate voted to approve the amended bill 27-15. After consulting his cabinet over the constitutionality of banning slavery in the territory, Monroe signed the bill on the 6th of March. Following the compromise, Maine was admitted to the Union on the 15th of March, 1820, as a free state, and Missouri entered the Union on the 10th of August, 1821, as a slave state. The Missouri Compromise was the first in a series of compromises between North and South over the future of slavery, which kept the country together for another 40 years, but the question was finally put to rest after the bloody American Civil War. Despite Monroe's fears that he would not be reelected, the collapse of the Federalist Party and the president's nonpartisan policies ensured that he faced minimal opposition in the 1820 election. However, the country remained in an economic slump, and Crawford informed Congress that the deficit had increased to $7 million, leading to cuts in the Army and military fortifications, 2 things that Monroe had championed. Furthermore, the Missouri debate of the previous year brought an end to the era of good feelings, and the Republican Party began to split into 2. While the president continued to enjoy considerable popular support, party leaders who called themselves Old Republicans argued that the president had adopted Federalist ideas and longed to return to the Jeffersonian tradition of states' rights and limited government. The leader of the old Republicans was Senator Martin Van Buren, who found an ally in Monroe's cabinet in the form of Treasury Secretary William Crawford. When the new congressional session opened in March 1821, the old Republican Philip Barber was elected Speaker of the House, threatening to make Monroe's life difficult. Early in his second term, Monroe received a proposal from the American Colonization Society to establish a colony on the coast of West Africa to repatriate slaves freed by American naval vessels, enforcing the ban on the Atlantic slave trade that Congress had enacted in 1808. Monroe recalled his correspondence with Jefferson on the subject 2 decades earlier and considered the proposals as a potential solution for emancipation of slaves within the United States. However, he believed that as President of the United States, he did not have the constitutional authority to purchase land in Africa and could only encourage the Society's cause and ask Congress to provide funds for the Society. The colony was eventually named Liberia, and the Society named its capital Monrovia in recognition of the President's support. As he considered potential solutions to the problem of slavery, Monroe also hardened his attitudes towards the Native Americans. Although he respected the Indians and had previously agreed to protect Indian lands, the westward expansion he promoted inevitably resulted in white Americans settling on native lands, thus leading to violent clashes. Monroe became increasingly convinced that the only way for Native Americans to survive was to assimilate them into American society by promoting education and Christianization. By the end of his presidency, he called for the Native American tribes of the eastern United States to voluntarily move west beyond the Mississippi, a policy that Andrew Jackson would use military force to achieve in the 1830s. Throughout his presidency, Monroe insisted on the importance of public infrastructure, such as roads and canals, to connect the states and facilitate commerce. However, when Congress passed a bill to repair the Cumberland Road, which passed through Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, Monroe vetoed it based on his belief that it was unconstitutional. His veto message from May 1822 was accompanied by a lengthy report asking Congress to recommend a new amendment to do so, which he had been demanding from Congress for several years. In the meantime, Congress could raise the funds for improvements and assign them to the states to carry out the work. Monroe hoped that his proposal would encourage support around the country for national improvements, but Congress adjourned without acting on his recommendations. In 1824, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in the Gibbons v. Ogden case that Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce, including for navigation, but it came too late in Monroe's presidency for him to implement his agenda. While Monroe's influence on domestic policy was waning, events in Latin America would inspire his most enduring legacy. For more than a decade, Spain's Latin American colonies faced rebellions led by Bernardo O'Higgins in Chile, José San Martin in Argentina, and Simón Bolívar in Colombia. For much of his presidency, Monroe pursued a policy of neutrality, rejecting Henry Clay's calls for recognition of the republics due to the delicate nature of Spanish-American negotiations over Florida. Monroe had been sympathetic to the South American republics and saw the opportunity for a major expansion of trade, and in the spring of 1822, he informed Congress he would recognize Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. On the 19th of June, Monroe and Adams granted official recognition to the veteran Colombian diplomat Manuel Torres. Although Monroe was certain that Spain was unable to recover its colonies, he feared that other European powers might try and help Spain to do so. Under the influence of Tsar Alexander of Russia and Prince Metternich of Austria, in 1815, Austria, Prussia, and Russia signed the Holy Alliance, which aimed to suppress revolutionary insurrections, and by 1822, France had joined the alliance before sending an army to Spain to restore King Ferdinand to absolute power in 1823. When Monroe received word from the Tsar in October 1823, that he would not recognize the South American republics. He feared an imminent intervention from the Holy Alliance. Meanwhile, American ambassador to Great Britain, Richard Rush, had been discussing the question with Foreign Secretary George Canning, who was not yet prepared to recognize the new republics, but proposed issuing a joint declaration disclaiming any part of the Spanish colonies and opposing their transfer to any other power. Monroe wrote to Jefferson and Madison for advice on how to respond to the proposals, and both ex-presidents advocated accepting them. However, Adams argued that accepting Canning's proposals would tie American hands over Texas and other Spanish colonies that the United States might one day wish to incorporate. By late November, Rush informed Monroe that Canning was no longer interested in a joint declaration, but Monroe and Adams already decided on issuing a unilateral declaration. In a message to Congress on the 2nd of December 1823, Monroe asserted that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. As the United States did not have much of a navy to speak of, it lacked the means to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, but it contributed to America's assertiveness in foreign policy as it emerged as a great power during the 19th century. In 1824, during the last year of his presidency, Monroe helped to organize the Marquis de Lafayette's tour of the United States and received his old friend at the White House in October. The presidential election that year was destined to be one of the most contested in American history. The major candidates included three of Monroe's cabinet secretaries, Adams, Calhoun, and Crawford, as well as Henry Clay and General Andrew Jackson. Calhoun dropped out of the race early and became favorite for the vice presidency. While Jefferson and Madison backed Crawford, Monroe remained neutral in the race, though his personal sympathies may have been with Adams. When the electoral votes were counted, Jackson won 43% of the vote and 99 electoral votes, while Adams came second with 32% and 84 electoral votes. With no candidate winning a majority of the Electoral College, it was up to the House of Representatives to choose between the top three finishers, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. With his presidential ambitions thwarted for the time being, Clay agreed to support Adams in return for the State Department and ensured that Adams would receive backing of Kentucky and Ohio. On the 9th of February 1825, Adams won 13 states, Jackson 7 and Crawford 4, and on the 4th of March, John Quincy Adams succeeded James Monroe as President of the United States. After leaving the presidency, Monroe retired to his farm at Oak Hill in Loudoun County. He was heavily indebted, and his request for Congress to pay off the debts he incurred in public service would be debated for several years, forcing him to sell part of his Highland estate and give the rest to the Bank of the United States in lieu of payment. Monroe continued to visit Jefferson until Jefferson's death on the 4th of July, 1826. Jefferson's passing created a vacancy on the University of Virginia's Board of Visitors, and Monroe was appointed to the body and resumed his collaboration with Madison, the newly elected rector. In October, President Adams offered his predecessor the opportunity to represent the United States at the Pan American Congress in Panama, but Monroe declined, owing to his financial situation and his wife Elizabeth's poor health. The United States ended up sending 2 observers, but one died, and the other arrived after the end of the meeting, thus allowing Great Britain to sign a series of trade agreements with the independent Latin American republics. While Monroe was pleading for financial assistance from Congress, he was subjected to attacks in the press by General Jackson, who accused him of siding with Adams in the 1824 election. Monroe remained neutral in the rematch in 1828, which saw Jackson leading the Democratic Party on the ticket with Vice President Calhoun challenging President Adams and Richard Rush on a national Republican ticket. When the votes were counted, Jackson won the presidency with 178 electoral votes, mainly from the South and the West, while Adams' 83 electoral votes were largely concentrated in the former Federalist stronghold of New England. In October 1829, Monroe performed his final public duties by presiding over a convention to consider the issue of representation in the western districts of Virginia. After the death of his wife Elizabeth on the 23rd of September 1830, Monroe joined his daughter, Eliza, in New York City. Though Congress finally awarded him $30,000 in February 1831 to enable him to pay off his remaining debts, his health further declined, and he died in New York at the age of 73 on the 4th of July, 1831, exactly 5 years after his friend and mentor, Thomas Jefferson. Monroe was initially buried in New York, but upon the centenary of his birth in 1858, his remains were transferred to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, where his wife Elizabeth's remains were reinterred from Oak Hill in 1903. While he may not enjoy the fame of the four presidents before him, James Monroe's record of political and military service to the early American Republic extended to half a century. As a young officer, he fought in the Revolutionary War with distinction and was almost killed at Trenton during one of the most dramatic battles of the war. He befriended Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and was their close collaborator in their opposition to the Federalists. His record as a diplomat is mixed, and despite playing a key role in securing the Louisiana Purchase, most of his negotiations with Britain, France, and Spain came to nothing. Despite briefly falling out with both Jefferson and Madison, Monroe eagerly served in the latter's cabinet as Secretary of State and Secretary of War, helping to rescue a flagging war effort and delivering the crucial instructions that enabled the United States to emerge intact from the War of 1812. As president, he was frustrated by his limited powers to address the economic crisis and the lack of congressional support over his agenda to improve national defenses and transport infrastructure. His greatest achievements lay in foreign policy, acquiring control of Florida from Spain and formulating the influential foreign policy statement that bears his name. Monroe led the country during an era of political consensus, unseen since the days of George Washington, only to see the party and country on the verge of breaking apart over the future of slavery. Like Jefferson and Madison before him, Monroe recognized the injustice of slavery, but his personal interests and political ambitions prevented him from supporting emancipation. While he supported the work of the American Colonization Society, his proposed solution to end slavery by deporting blacks to Liberia was neither realistic nor just. The same applies to his policy of attempting to persuade Indian tribes to leave behind either their culture or their ancestral lands. What do you think of James Monroe? Was he an effective compromiser who brought the country together after the fierce disagreements between the Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians? Or did his conciliatory approach merely delay the inevitable and contribute to deeper and more violent divisions centered around slavery? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.